Good morning. It's July 31st, and we're in Romans 14 today. And as I've been saying a lot through Romans, it's very helpful that we have a chapter like this in Scripture. Paul here is talking about some gray area things, some things where we have to make decisions between disputed areas in the Christian life, and it's things that are peripheral, which is helpful. And here he uses a concrete example about food, and he, I think, means to use that as an example that there are other things that fall into this kind of category where we have to use this kind of discernment. And there's a couple of things I would like to talk about with that. First of which is that these things are symbols. In other words, there are a lot of different things in the world that stand for something greater than they actually are in reality. And so Paul brings it back to that, and he says, remember that food is just food, and we won't be eating and drinking forever. It's just something that's we deal with in this temporary life. And he says at one point that the Christian life is not just about food. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then the other thing is what we invest in those symbols. In other words, it's the symbols in themselves are neutral. Food in itself is neutral. It doesn't have any value one way or another. It's not good or evil in itself. But what somebody attaches to that is what is good or evil, and particularly how one then judges other people who have different ideas on those symbols. And that's what causes disunity within the body, is where we come to different conclusions regarding the value of that symbol. In other words, let's just say it's meat, right? Meat sacrificed to idols, for instance. And there are two different ways to look at that. Either you can look at it and say, well, an idol is nothing, and so nothing actually happened when that meat was sacrificed. And so if I can get a discount by buying it because it had been sacrificed, then really all I'm doing is saving money. There's nothing concrete about that that's sinful. The other way of looking at that is that I don't want to have any involvement at all with anything that is pagan or idolatry. And so better for me to stay away from that, or even pay a little bit more for meat that wasn't sacrificed to idols, so I would avoid any kind of contact with that. Either one of those opinions is okay. And that's what Paul is wrestling with his audience. The issue then becomes, how do we look at other people who come to a different conclusion on that matter? And do we judge them based on that conclusion? And that's where Paul says that we ought not to do that. And wherever we can, we want to live at peace with other people as well. And so if there's something that we know is going to be a stumbling block to somebody else, we ought to just avoid it, just out of love for that person, because the thing itself isn't nearly as important as the person is and their conscience is. And so whenever we would make a decision that might be detrimental to somebody else, we ought to just defer to them in that, even if it doesn't bother our conscience, or even if it's a sacrifice on our part to have to do that, it's worth it, because those things are temporary, whereas the people are eternal. And so I think it's really important that this chapter exists in Scripture. It helps us really to flesh out some of these things that can be difficult within church life, and that's one of those things that causes strife and division in the church. That's it for today.